Tonight, we travel to the very edge of the known medieval world. Far beyond the familiar farms of Norway, beyond the trading towns of Iceland, past the restless gray waters of the North Atlantic, there lies a coastline of stone and silence. A place where the wind moves almost constantly. A place where grass grows reluctantly. A place that was given a hopeful name: Greenland. In this episode, we will drift slowly into the lives of the Norse settlers who chose, by ambition, by exile, or by necessity, to build their homes along its fjords. We will walk through their turf houses and stand beside their thin pastures. We will follow the restless journey of Eric the Red, whose ambition helped shape this fragile colony. We will consider the long cooling of the climate during the Little Ice Age, and the quiet mystery of settlements that were eventually abandoned. We will explore how faith shifted from old gods to Christian churches, how walrus ivory connected these remote farms to distant European markets, how power was structured among chieftains and farmers, and finally, we will sit for a while inside the warm, flickering hall of a Norse leader, where feasts glowed against the surrounding darkness. This is not a story of conquest in the dramatic sense. It is a story of endurance, of wind against wood, of ice against stone, of human hope pressed thin by weather. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. The fjord is quiet tonight. The grass bends low beneath the wind. And somewhere beneath a roof of sod and timber, a small fire is being coaxed back to life. Imagine waking before dawn in a turf house near Brattahlid, sometime around the year 1000. The air inside is cool even in summer. In winter, it is nearly as cold as the world outside. Your bed is a wooden platform lined with wool and animal skins. They smell faintly of smoke, lanolin, and the sea. The walls around you are not made of stone, nor clean timber, but layered earth, thick blocks of turf cut from the ground and stacked carefully to hold back the wind. You can hear that wind now. It presses against the house in long, steady sighs. It moves across the fjord, schemes over low grass, and rattles the wooden door on its leather hinges. It never truly stops. It softens then returns. Softens then returns. You rise quietly. There is no glass in the windows, only openings covered with oiled cloth or thin animal membrane. Light enters reluctantly. In winter there will be very little of it. The sun may linger for only a few hours before sliding back below the horizon, leaving a prolonged twilight. You pull on heavy woolen layers. Everything you wear is thick, practical, and slightly damp from the night's condensation. There are no bright dyes here. No silks. No abundance of spare fabric. Every thread represents labor. Outside, the settlement is small. A scattering of turf-roofed buildings crouch close to the earth, as if trying not to be noticed by the landscape. Beyond them, steep slopes rise toward higher, rockier ground. And beyond that, the vast inland ice. The soil beneath your boots is thin. That is perhaps the first and most persistent challenge of life here. The earth does not easily give. Greenland's coastal fringes can support grass for grazing, but only just. There are no wide golden fields of grain as in Norway. No generous valleys overflowing with crops. If you wish for bread, it must often come from trade, or not at all. Your morning task is to check the livestock. Cattle are valuable here. Sheep and goats are more resilient, but cows represent stability, wealth, and nourishment. Yet keeping them alive through winter is a constant calculation. In summer, you cut hay from every patch of viable grass you can find. You dry it carefully. You store it in cramped barns. And then, during the long dark months, you measure it out cautiously, hoping it will last until spring. If the hay runs short, the animals weaken. If the animals weaken, milk dwindles. If milk dwindles, your family's diet becomes narrower still. There are days when you will eat mostly dried fish. Days when your meals consist of thin porridge, a little dairy, perhaps preserved meat from the previous autumn's slaughter. Fresh vegetables are rare. Fruit is nearly non-existent. The variety of your diet depends heavily on season and luck. Fishing helps. The fjords are generous compared to the soil. Cold waters hold cod and other fish. You rise early, push out small boats, mend nets again and again. The salt air clings to your hair and beard. Your hands grow rough from rope and oar. But even fishing is not effortless. Storms sweep in quickly. The sea turns dark and impatient. A small miscalculation can cost you your boat or your life. There are no lighthouses here. No organized rescue. Only judgment, experience, and the mercy of weather. And the weather is rarely gentle. Winters are long. Snow accumulates around the buildings, pressing in at the doors. Paths between structures must be shoveled repeatedly. Smoke from the central hearth struggles to escape through roof vents, sometimes curling back into the room. Your eyes sting. Your lungs feel the weight of constant wood smoke. Fuel is scarce. Greenland does not offer forests like Scandinavia. Driftwood becomes precious. Every piece that washes ashore is gathered. Dung from livestock is dried and burned. Nothing combustible is wasted. The monotony is perhaps as challenging as the cold. Days follow a similar rhythm. Feed animals, mend tools, spin wool, repair boats, check fences, watch the sky, wait for seasons to shift. There are no bustling markets nearby, no constant flow of travelers. The eastern settlement, where Brattahlid stands, contains perhaps a few thousand people at its height, spread across wide distances. Neighbors may be hours away by foot or boat. Isolation is woven into daily life. Communication with Europe is uncertain. Ships from Iceland or Norway might arrive in summer, if sea ice allows it. They bring iron, timber, news. But some years no ship comes. When that happens, you rely only on what you have stored and what you can improvise. Tools break. Iron is limited. You reuse nails. You salvage metal from old equipment. A broken axe is not easily replaced. Craftsmanship becomes careful and conservative. Nothing is discarded lightly. Social life is modest. Gatherings occur, especially during religious observances or seasonal events, but daily existence is largely domestic and practical. You know the faces around you well. There are few strangers. Children grow up quickly here. From an early age, they assist with tending sheep, collecting eggs, scraping hides. They learn the boundaries of the fjord, the shifting character of the weather. Play exists, certainly, but always alongside responsibility. And beneath everything lies a subtle tension. You are aware, perhaps not constantly but persistently, that you live at the margin. The land feels provisional, capable of supporting you, yes, but not indulgently. A series of poor summers, a particularly brutal winter, a missed trade ship, and stability begins to thin. Still, there are moments of quiet beauty. In late summer, the grass glows green against dark stone. Wildflowers appear briefly, almost shyly. The fjord reflects pale blue light under an open sky. On calm evenings, the water lies still, and you can hear only distant seabirds and the low murmur of livestock settling for the night. In winter, the aurora sometimes drifts across the sky in pale ribbons. You step outside your turf house, breath clouding in the air, and look upward. The lights shimmer silently, indifferent to your struggles. You feel small, and yet you remain, because leaving is not simple. The voyage back across the North Atlantic is dangerous and expensive, because your family invested labor in this farm, because your chieftain expects loyalty, because this place, harsh as it is, has become familiar. Life here is not dramatic. It is repetitive, demanding, quietly exhausting. It is waking before light to tend animals. It is measuring hay with careful hands. It is watching the horizon for sails that may not appear. And it is enduring the wind, day after day, as it moves across turf roofs and low stone walls, whispering of distance. When you lie down at night, wrapped again in wool and skin, the fire dimming at the center of the room, you can hear that wind returning, softening, then strengthening, softening, then strengthening. A reminder that you live not at the center of a kingdom, but at the edge of the habitable world. Long before you were born into this wind-shaped life, before the turf walls were stacked and the cattle brought ashore, there was a man with red hair and a difficult reputation. His name was Eric the Red. To understand why you are here, measuring hay beneath a Greenland sky, it helps to drift back across the sea, to Iceland in the late 10th century. Iceland itself was a frontier then, settled only a few generations earlier by Norse families seeking land and autonomy beyond the reach of Norwegian kings. It was a society built on fragile balances. There were no centralized monarchs in Iceland. Power rested in the hands of chieftains, and disputes were resolved, at least in theory, through law courts and negotiated settlements at the Althing. But law in such a society depended heavily on honor, on restraint, on the willingness to accept compensation instead of revenge. Eric did not always choose restraint. He had been born in Norway, the son of a man who had already faced exile for violent conflict. The pattern would repeat. In Iceland, after a series of disputes over property and killings, murky by our standards, but serious by theirs, Eric was declared an outlaw. Outlawry in Iceland was not merely a legal inconvenience. It was a social erasure. You were cut off from protection. Anyone could harm you without consequence. Your property could be seized. Your presence in the community became intolerable. For 3 years, Eric was to live outside the protection of society. And so he turned west. There had been rumors, faint reports from sailors blown off course, of land beyond Iceland. A vast coastline glimpsed through fog and sea spray. Rocky, forbidding, but real. Eric gathered what he could. Ships, livestock, followers willing to gamble their futures. Perhaps some were loyal friends. Perhaps some were restless farmers facing limited prospects in Iceland's already crowded valleys. Perhaps some simply believed in the persuasive confidence of a man who refused to accept his own erasure. He sailed into uncertainty. Imagine those ships moving westward across the cold North Atlantic. Narrow wooden hulls rising and falling with heavy swells. Sailcloths snapping in relentless wind. No compass as we know it, only sun, stars, memory, and instinct. The voyage would not have been swift, nor particularly comfortable. Salt spray soaked everything. Provisions had to be carefully rationed. The horizon remained empty for long stretches. And then, land. Not lush and inviting as later retellings might imply, but jagged, stark. A coastline carved by ice and time. Eric explored the southwestern fjords during his years of exile. He found sheltered inlets where grass grew in summer, valleys where livestock might graze. Enough possibility to imagine permanence. When his term of outlawry ended, he returned to Iceland with a proposal. He did not call the new land the barren ice coast. He did not emphasize wind or scarcity. Instead, he named it Greenland. The name was not entirely inaccurate. There are indeed green stretches along certain fjords in summer, but it was aspirational, strategic, a gentle persuasion embedded in language. People are more willing to leave their homes for something that sounds abundant. And so, in the year 985, according to later accounts, a fleet of ships departed Iceland carrying families, livestock, tools, and timber. Not all of them arrived. Some turned back. Some were lost. But enough reached the fjords to establish what would become the eastern settlement. Among them was Eric, who chose a site for his own farm at Brattahlid. If you stand there now, imagining its earliest days, you might see wooden frames rising against the hills. Fresh-cut turf stacked carefully. Cattle stepping uncertainly onto new ground. Women unpacking chests filled with household goods. Children staring at mountains far larger and colder than any they had known. It was not conquest in the dramatic sense. There were no grand battles to claim this land. The indigenous Dorset people had occupied parts of Greenland long before Norse arrival, and later the Thule Inuit would move into the region. Interaction between Norse settlers and these Arctic peoples remains a subject of study and quiet debate. Contact may have been limited, occasional, or cautious. The evidence is fragmentary. But from the Norse perspective, this was a settlement at the margin of their known world. Eric became a chieftain here. Not a king in the formal sense, but a man of influence. His farm at Brattahlid grew into a central site, a place of assembly, a point of orientation in a scattered colony. His authority rested on land ownership, kinship ties, and reputation. Reputation mattered deeply. Eric's earlier conflicts in Iceland had led to exile. Here in Greenland, his ability to maintain order and stability would determine whether the settlement endured. Leadership in such a fragile environment required careful balancing, allocating pasture, resolving disputes, organizing seasonal hunts. He did not rule over abundance. He managed scarcity, and he watched the horizon. Because Greenland's survival depended on connection. Ships from Iceland and Norway brought iron, timber, and news. They carried walrus ivory and other goods outward in return. Without that exchange, isolation would deepen into vulnerability. Eric lived long enough to see the colony stabilize. Farms multiplied along the fjords. Churches would eventually be built. Families rooted themselves in turf and stone. Yet the edge never softened. Even in its most optimistic years, Greenland remained a place where each generation had to prove the settlement viable all over again. They had to be cut anew. Boats repaired anew. Alliances renewed. Eric himself did not live to see the colony's final chapter. His son, Leif Erikson, would later sail even farther west, reaching lands in North America. That is another story, one often told with more excitement than endurance. But here in Greenland, the legacy of Eric the Red is quieter. It is the shape of fields carved from reluctant soil. It is the outline of turf walls pressed low against wind. It is the pattern of settlement along fjords that offered just enough shelter. His ambition created opportunity, but also obligation. Because once you build a farm at the edge of the ice, once you bring cattle ashore and stack the first sod blocks, you are no longer simply exploring. You are committed. Committed to winters that may lengthen. Committed to trade routes that may falter. Committed to a landscape that does not promise generosity. And so, as you lie awake some nights in your turf house, listening to the wind pass over Brattahlid, you might reflect, quietly, on the choice made decades earlier by a red-haired exile. A choice born of conflict and confidence. A choice that carried families across the sea. A choice that placed you here, between fjord and ice, sustaining a fragile foothold on the westernmost edge of the Norse world. The wind continues outside, soft, then steady, then soft again. And in time, even the climate itself will begin to shift. For a time, the settlement holds. Summers, though brief, are workable. Grass grows across the low slopes in a thin but serviceable layer. Cattle graze. Sheep scatter across the hillsides. Ships arrive often enough to maintain a sense of connection with the wider Norse world. But climates do not remain fixed. They drift. They cool. They shift in patterns so gradual that no single year feels decisive. And yet, over decades, the difference becomes undeniable. What we now call the Little Ice Age was not a single event, nor a sudden freeze. It was a long period of cooling that began subtly in the late medieval period and deepened over centuries. For Greenland settlers, this cooling meant shorter summers, longer winters, and sea ice that lingered stubbornly along the coast. You would not have called it the Little Ice Age. You would have called it a poor summer. Then another. Then a winter that refused to release its grip. At first, the changes might seem like ordinary variation. A late thaw. A pasture that produces slightly less hay. A fjord that freezes earlier than expected. These are things one tolerates. Things one works around. But farming in Greenland is already a careful equation. You calculate how much hay your livestock require to survive winter. You measure your barn's capacity. You consider how many animals you can reasonably sustain without risking starvation in a difficult year. When summers shorten, grass grows more slowly. When autumn arrives early, haymaking becomes rushed. A sudden frost can damage what little growth you have. The margin narrows. Imagine standing in a field near Brattahlid at the end of August. The air feels cooler than it once did. The wind carries a sharper edge. You run your hands through the grass and sense that it is thinner, less dense. You cut and gather it anyway, stacking it carefully in your storehouse. You tell yourself it will be enough. Winter arrives with familiar darkness, but perhaps a little earlier. Snow drifts high against the walls of your turf house. The fjord freezes more completely than in previous years. Sea routes, once navigable in late spring, remain choked with ice. Isolation deepens. When sea ice lingers along Greenland's coast, ships from Iceland and Norway struggle to reach you. A trading vessel delayed by even a few weeks risks becoming trapped or damaged. Some captains may decide the voyage is no longer worth the danger. Fewer ships mean fewer supplies. Iron becomes scarcer. Timber more precious. News from Europe arrives infrequently, if at all. The wider medieval world continues its transformations. kingdoms shifting, cathedrals rising, but here the rhythm is defined by temperature and grass. Archaeological evidence suggests that as the climate cooled, the Norse settlers gradually adjusted their diets. In earlier years, their bones reveal a strong reliance on livestock, cattle, sheep, goats. But over time, marine resources appear to play a larger role. More seal, more fish. You adapt because you must. Seal hunting increases, particularly in spring when young seals are more accessible on the ice. This requires coordinated effort, skill, and patience. You travel farther from your farm. You accept greater exposure to weather. The irony is subtle but persistent. The Norse settlers had arrived from a farming tradition rooted in Scandinavia. Their identity was tied to cattle, pasture, and land ownership. Farming was not simply economic. It was cultural, a measure of status and stability. But Greenland, as it cools, pushes you toward the sea, toward practices that resemble more closely those of the Inuit populations to the north and west, who have long adapted to Arctic conditions through hunting and mobility. There is evidence of limited contact between Norse and Inuit groups during this period. Perhaps trade, perhaps wary observation. Yet cultural exchange seems to have been minimal. The Norse remain largely farmers in mindset, even as conditions favor a more flexible adaptation. And then there are the animals. Colder winters strain livestock. If hay stores run low before spring, difficult decisions follow. You may slaughter animals earlier than intended. You may watch weaker ones fail to survive. Each loss reduces next year's productivity. A single harsh winter can be endured. Several in succession begin to erode confidence. Glaciers expand during this period. Ice creeps farther down valleys. Landscapes shift subtly. Fields once marginal become untenable. Paths grow treacherous. You do not have climate data. You do not chart long-term temperature trends. You have memory. You remember when summers felt slightly warmer, when ships arrived more reliably, when grazing seemed easier. You compare quietly. Around communal gatherings, perhaps inside a church now standing at Brattahlid, you speak of seasons past, of the early days under Eric the Red, of better hay yields, of reliable trade. No one declares that the climate is changing in a grand scientific sense, but everyone feels the pressure. The Little Ice Age does not announce itself with spectacle. It expresses itself in repetition. A late thaw, a failed voyage, a thinner cow, a barn half empty by March. And beneath all of this lies a growing vulnerability in Greenland's economic structure. The colony depends on exports, particularly walrus ivory, to maintain trade with Europe. But if sea ice restricts shipping lanes, those exports cannot easily leave. If European demand shifts or alternative sources emerge, Greenland's economic relevance may decline. Climate pressure intertwines with economic fragility. The world beyond Greenland continues evolving. Political centers shift. Trade networks reorganize. The Black Death will eventually reshape Europe in the 14th century, altering labor systems and priorities. Greenland, distant and small, becomes easier to forget. You, however, do not feel forgotten in dramatic fashion. You feel cold. You feel the strain of cutting hay from reluctant earth. You feel the uncertainty of scanning a frozen horizon for sails. You feel the weight of winter lingering just a little longer than it once did. Children grow up knowing only this cooler reality. For them, there is no contrast, no memory of warmer decades. They accept the shortened summers as normal, the longer winters as given. Adaptation becomes generational. Yet adaptation has limits. By the 14th and early 15th centuries, evidence suggests that conditions for the Norse settlements are steadily worsening. The western settlement, smaller and more remote, appears to be abandoned first. Records from Iceland mention that it was found deserted, livestock roaming unattended. The eastern settlement lingers longer. But the pattern is becoming clear. Greenland is not growing more generous. It is growing more demanding. And still each morning you rise. You tend animals. You mend tools. You look to the fjord. Life continues because daily tasks do not wait for climate analysis. The wind carries fine grains of snow across the yard. The sky remains pale and distant. In the quiet, you sense that something larger than any single winter is unfolding. Not a storm, not a single disaster, but a slow tightening of the world around you. The ice presses closer, the summers shrink, and the settlement, once born of ambition and optimism, begins to feel increasingly fragile beneath the vast, indifferent sky. At first, there is no dramatic ending, no final battle, no single night of catastrophe, no recorded farewell. Instead, there is absence. By the early 15th century, ships arriving from Iceland, or attempting to find fewer signs of life along Greenland's fjords. Letters from Europe go unanswered. Trade diminishes. Clergy appointed to serve the colony struggle to reach it. Eventually, written references to the settlements become faint, then infrequent, then still. The western settlement appears to have been abandoned sometime in the 1300s. The eastern settlement lingers longer, perhaps into the early 1400s. After that, silence. Centuries pass. Wind continues to move over the turf mounds. Snow gathers and melts. Grass grows thinly where cattle once grazed. And then, much later, explorers and archaeologists begin to search. They find ruins. Collapsed turf walls barely rising above the ground. Stone outlines of churches. Farmsteads whose wooden beams have long since rotted away. The landscape has partially reclaimed what was once carefully arranged. One of the most evocative sights is the church at Valsey in the eastern settlement. Its stone walls remain standing, sturdy, deliberate, almost serene against the surrounding fjord. Records indicate that a wedding took place there in 1408, a union noted in Icelandic documents. It is the last clearly dated event from Norse Greenland. After that wedding, the written record fades. Standing within the ruins today, one might imagine the ceremony, voices echoing softly against stone, wool cloaks brushing across the floor, the faint scent of smoke from nearby hearths. Outside, the wind moves over the fjord as it always has. But the people who attended that wedding left no explanation for what came next. Archaeological excavations across Greenland's former Norse settlements reveal patterns, but not certainty. At some farms, animal bones suggest increasing reliance on marine food, seals and fish, particularly in later centuries. This aligns with the cooling climate and agricultural strain. In some western settlement sites, skeletal remains of livestock appear scattered, as if animals were left untended. An Icelandic source mentions that when the western settlement was visited in the 14th century, it was found deserted, cattle wandering wild. The church still stood, but the people were gone. Gone where? There are theories. One possibility is gradual migration. As conditions worsened, families may have chosen to leave in small groups, returning to Iceland or even Norway. Departure would not have been easy. Ships were scarce, voyages dangerous, but not impossible. Another possibility is assimilation. The Thule Inuit, ancestors of modern Greenlandic Inuit, were expanding into southern Greenland during this period. Contact between Norse and Inuit likely occurred. Trade may have taken place. There may have been cautious observation, perhaps limited cooperation. Some scholars wonder whether small numbers of Norse settlers eventually joined Inuit communities, adapting to a more Arctic-focused way of life. There is little concrete evidence for large-scale assimilation, but the possibility lingers. Conflict has also been suggested. Yet there is no strong archaeological evidence of widespread violent destruction in the settlements. No mass graves bearing marks of battle. No charred ruins indicating large-scale attacks. Starvation is another theory, but again the evidence does not suggest sudden mass death. Rather, it suggests gradual decline. Perhaps the most plausible explanation is also the least dramatic: a slow, multi-causal fading. Climate cooling, economic isolation, reduced trade, soil erosion from overgrazing, shifting European demand for walrus ivory, increased sea ice limiting voyages, layer upon layer of pressure. And under such pressure, a small remote colony may simply thin out. One farm abandoned, then another. A chieftain's hall no longer maintained. A church left without clergy. Grass grows where fields were once cut. Doors remain closed and eventually fall from their hinges. Archaeologists have uncovered personal artifacts that feel quietly intimate. Spindle whorls for spinning wool, fragments of combs, iron tools worn thin from repair. These objects suggest ordinary life continuing to the end, households functioning, clothing being made, animals tended. There is no clear sign that the settlers believed they were living through their final chapter. That is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the mystery. From within the settlement, daily life likely felt difficult, but not apocalyptic. You would still rise at dawn, still feed animals, still mend nets. Perhaps you would discuss the lack of ships, the colder winters. Perhaps you would consider sending a son abroad if opportunity arose. But you would not necessarily imagine that future generations would walk through your abandoned church and wonder what became of you. The silence that follows is not loud. It is subtle. By the time European ships begin regularly exploring the North Atlantic again in later centuries, the Norse presence in Greenland has become legend. Stories survive in Icelandic sagas, accounts of Eric the Red of Leif's voyages westward, but the farms themselves have returned largely to Earth. When Danish missionaries and traders re-established contact with Greenland in the 18th century, they encounter Inuit communities, not Norse farmers. The turf houses of Brattahlid are long collapsed. The hayfields have reverted to open grass. The cattle are gone. What remains are stones arranged in rectangles. Church walls open to the sky. Quiet burial grounds where bones lie beneath centuries of soil. The mystery invites speculation, but it also invites restraint. Sometimes settlements do not end with spectacle. They diminish, they thin, they loosen their hold. Perhaps the final families departed in late summer, loading what possessions they could onto a ship. Perhaps a few remained longer, holding to habit until survival became untenable. Perhaps some walked northward, joining Inuit communities and learning new ways of reading ice and sea. We cannot know with certainty. And so the abandoned settlements of Norse Greenland rest in a space between history and silence. Wind passes over them. Snow gathers lightly in winter. Arctic foxes move across old farm boundaries without noticing. The mystery is not violent. It is quiet, a fading at the edge of the known world. And yet, before that fading, there were centuries of belief, of rituals and prayers offered in turf houses and stone churches alike. Belief that sought to make sense of wind and ice in isolation. In the next segment, we will drift into that interior world, into the shifting spiritual landscape of Greenland settlers, from Old Norse gods to Christian altars, and how faith itself adapted, or resisted, at the margin of the medieval world. Before the stone church stood at Valsey, before wedding vows were spoken beneath a wooden cross, the spiritual life of Greenland settlers was shaped by older rhythms. When the first ships arrived under Eric the Red in the late 10th century, the Norse world was in transition. Scandinavia and Iceland were gradually converting to Christianity, but the older belief system, what we now call Norse paganism, had not yet fully receded. If you had grown up in Iceland before sailing west, you would likely have known the names of Odin, Thor, and Freya. You would have heard stories of Asgard and Midgard, of giants and frost, of a cosmos held together by the great tree Yggdrasil. These stories were not abstract theology. They were woven into poetry, law, and daily speech. Thor's hammer was not just a symbol, it was protection. Odin was not distant. He was present in war, in wisdom, in sacrifice. Greenland, harsh and immense, may have felt like a place where such gods were particularly relevant. Frost giants, after all, belonged to icy realms and myth. The wind that pressed against your turf house might easily be imagined as a reminder of larger, unseen forces. And yet, Christianity was advancing. In the year 1000, Iceland officially adopted Christianity at the Althing, seeking unity and avoiding internal conflict. This decision would ripple outward, including to Greenland. According to later sagas, it was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who encountered Christianity abroad and brought the faith back with him. Whether the details are precise or shaped by storytelling, we know that by the 11th century, Christianity had taken firm root in Greenland. Imagine the gradual shift. At first, perhaps, a small wooden church erected near Brattahlid. A modest structure, its beams carried across the sea. Inside, a simple altar. A priest, possibly trained in Iceland or Norway, reciting Latin words that most settlers did not fully understand, but whose cadence felt solemn and ordered. The older gods did not vanish overnight. Conversion in medieval societies was often layered. Old customs lingered beneath new rituals. Burial practices, feast days, seasonal observances, these evolved gradually. Archaeologists note changes in burial orientation over time. Pagan graves sometimes included goods. Christian graves became simpler, aligned east-west in expectation of resurrection. The presence of churches in Greenland suggests that Christianity became institutionalized. By the 12th century, Greenland had its own bishopric with its seat at Gerör. Stone churches were built, solid, deliberate, intended to endure. Faith here was not only spiritual, it was connective. Christianity linked Greenland to Europe. It placed the settlement within a broader ecclesiastical network stretching from Rome to Norway. Bishops traveled, when sea conditions allowed. Tithes were collected. Religious authority provided structure to an otherwise isolated colony. You would attend Mass regularly. On Sundays, you walk across frosted grass toward the church. The wind pulls at your cloak. Inside, the air smells of wool and faint incense, perhaps sparingly used given the difficulty of supply. Candles flicker against stone walls. The priest speaks of saints, of sin, of salvation. In a land of thin soil and long winters, the promise of eternal life may have felt particularly resonant. Christian cosmology offered a different narrative from the older Norse myths. Instead of cyclical destruction and rebirth at Ragnarok, there was a linear story: creation, fall, redemption, judgment. There was a heaven beyond ice and hardship. Yet even within Christian practice, the environment shaped expression. Saints associated with seafaring and protection might have held special meaning. Prayers for safe voyages would be common. The sea was both lifeline and threat. Divine favor seemed necessary. Archaeological remains of churches in Greenland are strikingly solid. The Valsey Church, for example, still stands in partial form today, its stone walls intact, open to the sky. It suggests a community willing to invest labor and resources into religious architecture, even in a marginal environment. Stone is heavy. Transporting it is laborious. Constructing walls requires coordination. That effort implies commitment, not merely to survival but to continuity. The churchyard burials are orderly, bodies laid to rest with care. Even in the colony's later years, as climate cooled and trade faltered, Christian practice appears to have persisted. Faith can endure beyond material stability. And yet, Christianity may also have influenced how the Norse settlers adapted, or did not adapt, to Greenland's changing conditions. Some scholars suggest that maintaining European-style farming and social structures was tied not only to culture but to identity. To be Christian Norse farmers was to belong to a certain world. Adopting Inuit subsistence strategies more fully, becoming primarily seal hunters, for example, might have felt like a departure from that identity. Belief shapes behavior subtly. If your worldview emphasizes pastoral imagery, shepherds, flocks, cultivated land, you may persist in farming even when conditions grow increasingly difficult. If your rituals center on churches and bishops connected to Europe, you may resist turning entirely toward Arctic modes of life. That is not to say the Norse were inflexible. They hunted seal extensively. They fished. They adapted where they could. But identity is powerful. Inside your turf house at night, after evening prayers, you might still recall fragments of older stories. Thor's hammer protecting against unseen forces, Odin's sacrifice for wisdom. Perhaps a carved amulet lingers in a family chest, inherited from a grandparent. Conversion does not erase memory. Instead, the two layers coexist for a time. Old rhythms beneath new liturgy. Wind across fjords carrying both saga and psalm. By the 14th century, Christianity in Greenland was fully integrated. The bishopric at Gerør connected the colony to Norway. Tithes were sent abroad. Clergy maintained sacramental life. But as ships arrived less frequently during the cooling climate, ecclesiastical ties weakened. A bishop appointed in Norway might never successfully reach Greenland. A priest might go years without external contact. Faith, once a bridge to Europe, becomes increasingly local. The stone church still stands. The prayers still rise. But the world beyond feels distant. And perhaps in the quiet moments between ritual and routine, some settlers wondered whether God's providence extended quite as clearly to this windswept margin. Yet doubt, if present, leaves little trace in the archaeological record. What remains are walls, graves, fragments of devotional objects. Evidence that even at the edge of ice and isolation, human beings sought meaning beyond the material. Meaning beyond hay yields and sea ice. Meaning beyond the slow cooling of the world. In the next segment, we will turn from faith to economy, to the fragile thread that tied Greenland to Europe through a single valuable resource: walrus ivory. If faith connected Greenland to heaven, trade connected it to Europe. Without trade, the settlement would have remained isolated in a way that was not merely emotional but practical. Iron was not mined here. Timber was scarce. Certain tools, fabrics, and ceremonial objects had to be imported. And in exchange, Greenland needed something that Europe desired. For several centuries, that something was walrus ivory. Imagine standing on the edge of the fjord in early spring. The sea ice has not yet fully broken apart. The light is thin but lengthening. This is the season when walrus hunts become possible, particularly farther north where large herds gather on ice floes and rocky coasts. The hunt is not impulsive. It is organized. Small groups of men travel by boat along the coast, sometimes venturing far beyond the familiar farms of the eastern settlement. They carry ropes, spears, knives, and provisions. The journey can last weeks. The sea is unpredictable. Ice shifts without warning. Walruses are massive creatures. Their tusks, long, curved, and dense, are what matter most for trade. In Europe, walrus ivory is carved into religious objects, chess pieces, knife handles, and luxury goods. Before African elephant ivory became more widely available, walrus tusks were a prized material in northern markets. You approach the haul-out site cautiously. The animals lie clustered together, heavy bodies pressed against one another, their breath visible in the cold air. The hunt requires coordination. It requires strength. It requires risk. The details need not be dramatic. What matters is that this hunt sustains the colony's economic link to the outside world. Once tusks are secured, they must be transported back to the settlements, cleaned, prepared, and stored carefully. They represent not immediate nourishment, but future exchange. Summer is the season of ships. If sea ice retreats sufficiently, vessels from Iceland or Norway may arrive. They anchor in sheltered fjords. News is exchanged. Goods are tallied. In return for walrus ivory, Greenland receives iron tools, timber planks, perhaps cloth or grain. Items that cannot be produced locally. The trade is delicate. It depends on European demand for ivory. It depends on safe sea routes. It depends on Greenland's ability to organize hunts effectively despite a cooling climate. For a time, this system works. Archaeological evidence suggests that walrus ivory from Greenland reached markets in Europe, even as far as major ecclesiastical centers. Carved pieces found in medieval contexts likely originated from Arctic tusks. Some scholars even suggest that famous objects, such as intricately carved chess pieces discovered in Scotland, may have been fashioned from Greenlandic ivory. The colony's identity becomes partially tied to this trade. Farmers are not only tending cattle and cutting hay, they are participants in a transatlantic network. The fjords, though remote, are connected by invisible lines to cathedrals and workshops thousands of kilometers away. Yet, as with climate, markets shift. By the 13th and 14th centuries, alternative sources of ivory, particularly from Africa, become more accessible to European traders. Elephant ivory is abundant and, in many cases, easier to acquire through expanding trade routes in the Mediterranean and beyond. Demand for walrus ivory begins to wane. At the same time, the Little Ice Age complicates shipping lanes. Sea ice lingers longer along Greenland's coast. Fewer ships attempt the voyage. Fewer ships succeed. The economic equation grows strained. Imagine preparing tusks for export, stacking them carefully in anticipation of a trading vessel that never arrives. Weeks pass, then months. The sea remains empty. Tusks cannot be eaten. They cannot repair a broken plow. They cannot warm a house in winter. They are valuable only if someone comes to claim them. If trade diminishes, the settlement must rely increasingly on what it can produce locally. That means more pressure on limited pastureland, more emphasis on seal hunting and fishing, fewer imported goods. Iron tools become precious heirlooms. Broken blades are reforged again and again. Timber from driftwood is salvaged meticulously. Nothing is wasted. There is also the matter of social expectation. Greenland's chieftains likely played a key role in organizing trade. They would coordinate hunts, store ivory, negotiate with visiting merchants. Trade reinforced their status. It connected them to European aristocracy and clergy. As trade weakens, so too does that outward-facing prestige. The colony does not collapse in a single moment of economic failure. Instead, the ties loosen gradually. Fewer ships, fewer goods, less incentive for Europe to maintain regular contact. From Europe's perspective, Greenland is distant, small, and increasingly marginal to larger political and commercial shifts. Kingdoms in Scandinavia become entangled in their own struggles. The Black Death devastates populations and alters priorities. Attention turns inward. From your perspective, standing on the fjord's edge, the change feels like waiting. Waiting for sails. Waiting for iron. Waiting for confirmation that you are still part of a broader world. The walrus ivory trade had once given Greenland purpose beyond subsistence. It justified the danger of voyages. It sustained a narrative of participation in medieval Christendom. As that trade fades, the settlement feels more isolated, not just physically but economically and psychologically. You remain farmers. You remain hunters. You remain believers. But the thin thread connecting you to distant markets frays. And in a land already pressed by climate and limited soil, that fraying matters. Because when the next difficult winter comes, when hay runs short and sea ice holds fast, there will be fewer external supports to rely upon. In the next segment, we will turn inward to examine how power and hierarchy functioned within Greenland itself. How chieftains and farmers structured authority in a landscape where mobility was limited and survival demanded cooperation. Life in Greenland was not only shaped by climate and trade. It was also shaped by the social structures that govern daily life, the relationships between chieftains, farmers, and everyone in between. Imagine the settlement from above. Turf houses and stone buildings cluster along narrow fjords, separated by hills, small rivers, and stretches of open grass. Farms may lie a day or more's walk apart. The landscape itself enforces a kind of isolation. Travel is slow, weather-dependent, and often uncomfortable. Snow, rain, or icy winds can make a short journey feel like a trek across the world. Within this space, chieftains hold influence. They are landowners of prominent farms. They are intermediaries between families, the church, and the broader Norse world. Authority is both practical and symbolic. A chieftain organizes communal work, coordinating hay cutting, overseeing the maintenance of shared structures, perhaps mediating disputes between neighbors. They represent stability in a landscape that offers so little naturally. Yet power is subtle. There is no standing army. Enforcement relies on social expectation, reputation, and alliances. A chieftain's influence is built over years, maintained through careful negotiation, and easily undermined by misjudgment. A poor harvest, a dispute mishandled, or a perceived slight can erode authority. Farmers, for their part, are largely autonomous, but they rely on the chieftain for infrastructure, security, and connection to Europe. They tend their own animals, cut their own hay, repair their own homes. Yet they contribute labor, attend communal events, and participate in seasonal obligations. Their lives are a delicate balance between independence and interdependence. Social mobility is limited. Birth determines much. Sons inherit land, daughters marry to reinforce alliances. A new family can arrive only if they bring resources or connections. For settlers at the margin of Greenland, opportunities to move or expand are constrained by the land itself. Pastures are finite. Grazing limits cannot easily be exceeded without risking erosion or starvation. Justice is also a form of hierarchy. Disputes are brought before local assemblies. Decisions may be recorded or passed orally. Punishments are more about compensation than retribution. A fine might be paid, a debt acknowledged, a dispute mediated. Rarely is law carried out through violence alone. Survival depends more on cooperation than on domination. Within families, authority is similarly structured. The head of the household directs labor, allocates food, and manages livestock. Children learn responsibility early. Household roles are divided by necessity: tending animals, spinning wool, preparing food, repairing structures. Each task is vital. Each task reinforces the hierarchy and rhythm of daily life. And yet, hierarchy is not entirely rigid. Community gatherings, seasonal festivals, religious observances, feasts, offer moments of shared participation. Advice is offered and received. Labor is coordinated. Skills and knowledge flow across households. In the harsh Greenlandic environment, flexibility is essential. Authority is most effective when it blends guidance with practical cooperation. The chieftain's decisions have consequences. If pastures are overused, hay yields decline. If disputes fester, labor is delayed. If harvests fail or ice blocks the fjord, the entire community suffers. In such a context, leadership is exercised quietly, deliberately, with a constant awareness of the fragility of life at the edge of the world. And in turn, the farmer's endurance sustains the social order. Every repaired fence, every harvested bale of hay, every careful ration of milk reinforces the structure. Power exists only insofar as it supports survival. Greenland is a place where hierarchy and practicality are inseparable. The contrast between chieftain and farmer is subtle but perceptible. Both rise before dawn. Both tend animals and repair homes. Both measure hay and watch the fjord for approaching ships. The chieftain may enjoy slightly larger quarters, a more solid timber frame, perhaps occasional luxury imports. But both are subject to the same wind, the same ice, the same winter scarcity. Status provides small comfort against environmental reality, but it does not eliminate it. Daily life continues in this rhythm. The community persists, quietly negotiating labor, authority, and survival. The fjord remains calm or restless depending on the day. Smoke curls from turf roofs. Children run along narrow paths. Dogs bark faintly in the distance. The wind moves across low hills, indifferent to rank. Hierarchy in Greenland is a framework for cooperation more than dominance. Authority exists to organize effort, maintain shared resources, and preserve continuity in a landscape that offers no indulgence. And beyond the practical, it is a social fabric that also maintains memory. It preserves the traditions brought from Iceland. It shapes the transmission of faith, customs, and knowledge from one generation to the next. Hierarchy, then, is not just power. It is survival, structure, and continuity. In the next segment, we will step inside the chieftain's hall itself. We will slow our pace and observe a more refined, yet still intimate, daily life, the contrasts of warmth, light, and ritual that coexist with the harshness outside. Now imagine stepping inside the hall of a Greenlandic chieftain, perhaps at Brattahlid, the central farm of Eric the Red. The turf walls of the hall rise higher than ordinary houses, layered thickly to block wind and hold warmth. Timber beams stretch overhead, darkened with age and smoke. The floor is packed earth, softened in places by rushes and firs. The smell is comforting, wood smoke mingling with cured hides and the faint tang of salt from the nearby fjord. A fire burns low in the central hearth. Its warmth radiates slowly, reflecting in the polished surfaces of wooden tables and benches. The light flickers, moving shadows across carved posts and the faces of those seated around the long hall. This is the center of the chieftain's domain, not only a place for governance but for daily life, rest, and subtle display of status. Meals are shared here, though not lavished by modern standards. A simple porridge might accompany dried meat or fish. Ale or skimmed milk is poured from wooden vessels. The chieftain and family occupy one side of the hall, slightly raised or distinguished by placement of cushions and furs. Guests or workers sit opposite. All share in a rhythm that is orderly and deliberate. Inside, time moves differently than outside. The wind rages beyond the thick turf walls, but within you can pause. Conversation is subdued, even measured. reflecting the practical yet ceremonious nature of the space. Decisions are discussed quietly: when to cut hay, who will repair boats, which families require assistance. Authority is exercised calmly, without theatricality, yet it is understood by all present. Clothing is heavier and more finely made than the typical farm garments. Layers of wool, dyed subtly or patterned with skill, signify status. Shoes are carefully maintained. A cloak might bear a clasp of imported metal. These details speak not of indulgence but of refinement, a contrast to the daily labor that defines life in Greenland. Ceremony exists here too. Seasonal feasts, religious observances, and visits from distant relatives or officials punctuate the ordinary. Songs may be sung quietly, sagas recited with care, prayers offered toward the rising sun or altar. The hall becomes both a refuge and a center of cultural memory, preserving practices that tie Greenland to Norway, Iceland, and beyond. Yet even here the environment remains ever-present. The walls shiver slightly with the wind. Snow presses against the doors. Salt-laden air permeates cracks in timber. The chieftain may sit comfortably, but the hall is a fragile fortress against a demanding world. Children and younger members of the household learn by observation. They watch how the chieftain moves through daily tasks, how guests are treated, how labor is coordinated. They absorb the rhythm of authority, the subtleties of timing, the quiet patience that marks successful leadership. Outside, the fjord glimmers in pale light. Within, the hall pulses with warmth, quiet movement, and the enduring hum of a household engaged in survival, ritual, and connection. It is the culmination of centuries of endurance, the material embodiment of community, faith, and adaptation at the edge of the world. Here, for a moment, the hardships of climate, isolation, and labor recede. Life is slower, softer, illuminated by firelight and careful attention. You can sit, breathe, and feel the contrast between the outside and the interior. The chieftain's hall is not a palace. It is not indulgent luxury. It is a place where survival, social order, and memory converge, where the ordinary becomes structured and endurance finds warmth. As the story of Greenland's Norse settlements draws to a close, we return to the wind and the fjords. Imagine standing once more outside, beneath the long shadows of the surrounding hills. The turf houses are low against the horizon. Snow drifts curl across pastures that were once carefully tended. The fjord reflects pale light, calm or restless depending on the day. And the wind continues its quiet, unceasing song, softening, then strengthening, softening again. The people who built these settlements endured much. They measured hay, repaired boats, tended livestock, and maintained faith in a world that demanded constant attention. They lived with isolation, scarcity, and a climate that became steadily harsher. Their economy relied on fragile trade. Their authority structures balanced necessity with hierarchy. And through it all, they adapted, slowly, deliberately, quietly. Yet despite their endurance, the settlements faded. Farms were abandoned. Churches were left open to the sky. The grass grew over pastures. Bones and artifacts whisper of lives lived at the edge of the known world. The reasons for disappearance remain partly a mystery. Climate, isolation, economic shifts, and the delicate balance of survival all played their part. And still, there are lessons in their quiet existence. Life in Greenland was neither dramatic nor catastrophic in the way history often celebrates. It was ordinary, patient, and persistent. It reminds us of the subtle endurance of human beings, the ability to adapt, to structure daily life, and to maintain belief in community even when the wider world feels distant. As you lie down tonight, imagine the warmth of a turf house. Feel the steady rhythm of the wind outside. Hear the quiet murmur of livestock settling. Picture the glow of a chieftain's hall, flickering with firelight as families gather to eat, to speak, to maintain the fragile continuity of life. Think of the snow drifting slowly across abandoned pastures, the fjord reflecting a pale light, the echoes of prayers and work that persist long after human hands have gone. There is a beauty here, subtle, enduring, gentle. The story of Greenland's Norse settlers is not one of conquest or spectacle. It is a story of patience, of quiet labor, of adaptation at the margins of habitability. It is a story that eases gradually into silence, much like the wind over the fjord. And now, as your breathing slows, as your mind drifts with the rhythm of the cold sea and the soft light of the Arctic sky, allow yourself to rest. Let the endurance of these settlers guide you into calm. Let the steady, unhurried unfolding of life at the edge of the world carry you gently towards sleep. The wind softens. The fire dims. The fjord lies still. And for tonight, you too are at the edge, safe, calm, and drifting slowly into quiet.